So I came across this YouTube channel called Genspect. It's Genspect. And they're doing a lot of really good stuff when it comes to this trans ideation that's going on these days in the United States and the Western world in general, but especially in the United States. It's crazy. But I've been watching their videos, and they have one talk that's given by Colin Wright. If you don't know who he is, he's a biologist, as I recall, and he was on Joe Rogan. That's where I first ran into this guy, but I haven't really seen him anywhere else because I don't follow him or try to find him. But I saw him on this, and what he says here is really good, and I want to make sure that this was captured and on my channel. Now, it might not pass copyright. I don't know if this is copywritten or not, but I'm going to try to put it up. It's probably not going to come out at a regular time that I'm putting up videos, so I want to make sure that we had a record of it just in case Genspect ever gets taken down or anything like that. So let's go ahead and take a look at what Colin Wright has to say about the sex binary.
I'm so glad to be following Heather's talk because I couldn't think of a better broad overview of the evolution of sex and sex differences more broadly. I'm going to be sort of zeroing in on the sex binary, what it is, why it matters. I kind of view this talk as sort of a sanity affirmation therapy, but I think you'll also learn some interesting facts as well, at least I hope you do. So firstly, why am I here to talk about sex? This is a conference about gender medicine, so it seems weird that you have a couple biologists come up here talking about how sex evolved and sex differences more broadly. And I'm kind of as perplexed as all of you are. Why are we talking about what biological sex is? But there's a really good reason for this. It's because a lot of ideas about sex are being undermined. So there's two basic pillars that a lot of the gender-affirming care medicine stands on. One of them is this idea that sex is a spectrum, that sex is comprised of a conglomeration of body parts. We can't really tell what sex an individual is. We can only talk about degrees of maleness and femaleness. Sex is mutable. If you just give male implants, they're kind of more male. If you cut off their breasts, now they're, implants, they're more female. Cut off their breasts, now they're kind of more on the male side of things. And then the other pillar that gender-affirming care rests on is this notion of brain sex. Okay, this is being construed as sort of gender identity and brain sex. This is also being used in court documents as a basis for gender-affirming care. And this idea is that your brain can have a sex that differs from your body, and that these can be out of alignment and can be brought into alignment. So they might have a model that kind of looks like this. So we have sort of a spectrum here. This is split into two levels. We have what they would call our sex assigned at birth, which is actually the sex observed and recorded at birth. And let's say that you're, oh, thank you. I never know when I'll get the claps. Let's say you have someone who's just a normal female, okay? They might say that their sex assigned at birth is female, okay? This is where they exist. But then they might say, oh, this is going ahead, I don't know why. They might say that let's say this female likes to, like sports, likes rough and tumble play. Maybe they're same-sex attracted as well. So they like a lot of things that are typically associated with being boys or men. And so they would say something like, well, they might have a sex assigned at birth that's female, but their brain sex is kind of more over here on the male side, okay? And then this is construed as this brain-body mismatch, okay? And so the idea behind gender-affirming care, well, one, we can't change your brain sex. That's conversion therapy in their minds. We can't do anything about that. But since sex is this mutable spectrum that's just comprised of body parts, well, we can give you hormones, we can give you surgeries, and we can change all those physical features that comprise one's sex, and we can turn this level of dysphoria sort of into alignment and give you sort of gender euphoria. So this is the kind of the basis for gender-affirming care. And so it really matters whether or not sex is a spectrum, whether it is mutable, whether it's just comprised of a bunch of body parts that can be moved willy-nilly and change your sex. I'm going to go over a couple of the arguments about why sex is actually binary, why it's not on a spectrum, because that's a really important aspect. It's fundamental to this entire thing. So the sex spectrum, I'm hoping to sort of carve this in half and show you why that it's binary. So what is biological sex? What are the sexes? Well, the sexes, male and female, they represent two distinct reproductive strategies, these evolved reproductive roles. Okay, males are defined as the sex that produces numerous small gametes or sperm, and we see those around the center here. Females are defined as the sex that yields fewer but larger gametes, or what we'd call eggs or ova. So we categorize individuals as male or female based on the type of gamete, sperm or ova, they can or are expected to produce. Since there's only two types of sex cells, gametes, sperm and ova, there can be only two sexes, and there are only two sexes. And this binary division between these two gametes forms the crux of biologists' description of sex as binary. Now, this really could be the end of the talk because that's really all you need to know at a fundamental level. But we'll go into more detail because there's a lot of activists trying to undermine this super basic concept. Okay. So, yeah, there's a lot of propaganda out there. We have figures like this in Scientific American. We have YouTube videos, why biological sex is a spectrum, with millions of views. This is kind of going ahead by itself. There's the Why Sex is Binary by Anne Fausto Sterling in the New York Times. There's Discover magazine about why sex is a spectrum. There's books about the sex spectrum. There's the Trevor Project. There's even more stuff that comes out. Scientific American is one of the leading propaganda outlets right now about this stuff. Well, here's why human sex isn't binary. San Francisco Chronicle, sex binary, that's a scientific falsehood according to them. Scientific American, to understand sex, says that the number of sexes differs depending on context. Washington Post, we can't look at the body, we need to look at the brain to find out what sex you are, apparently. So you might say, okay, well, this is just a bunch of op-eds, okay? But as long as this isn't in the scientific literature, everything should be okay. Uh-oh. So, Nature, this is like the most prestigious journal, at least was in the entire world. Apparently sex has been redefined. The idea of two sexes is simplistic. Biologists now think there's a wider spectrum than that. Didn't get the memo. Multivariate models of animal sex. Breaking binaries leads to a better understanding of evolution, of ecology and evolution. Interesting. This is one, sex gender. They won't even say the word sex as separate from gender. They want us to use the term sex gender or gender sex now. So that's being more common. There's more papers on that. These are monographs. I think this is the, what is this, the American Psychological Association, their flagship journal. And then there's Hormones of Behavior. This is a new paper. This I think is a couple weeks old. This is at least used to be a serious scientific publication. Let's look at the conclusion. I couldn't have imagined ever reading something like this in a scientific paper. They said, to be clear, this is a call to arms. Hold on, me. To implement this deconstructionist approach in lieu of binary sex frameworks, move away from this hypersimplistic sex model, and conceptualize sex and non-sex physiologies as multiple interacting variable and unbounded by gender limitations. So we're in like a full court press now of like this scientific literature getting crazy. So the arguments against the sex binary are kind of in two main categories. The first I call sex expansionism, and this is the idea that there are more than two sexes. Okay, so rather than there just being males and females, maybe there's four sexes, 6 sexes, 8 sexes, one more 4. And so that's one idea of it. This is different than sort of other arguments. Forward. What I call sex eliminationist arguments, which is this idea that instead of those two sexes, rather sex exists on a spectrum. There's, forward more here. We can't really talk about males and females per se, but males and females are these statistical realities. You can only approximate slightly. You can have degrees of maleness and femaleness, but you cannot be male or female. And again, this is viewed as like a mutable thing. So we're going to go more into sex expansionism here, and I'll go over one of the arguments for this type of argument. So the idea for sex expansionism is that, sorry, go forward here. So it's based on this misinterpretation of the idea that sex is determined by chromosomes. Now that's a true statement, but there's a lot of misconceptions over what that actually means. So a lot of people, including people who I would say on our side, who are trying to defend the reality of the sex binary, will say something like, oh, sex is determined by chromosomes. If you're XX, you're female. If you're XY, you're male. That's what they think the sex binary is, end of debate. But then activists will then point out saying like, well, there's more compositions of sex chromosomes beyond just XX and XY. We have, Jacob's syndrome. We have triple X syndrome, Klinefelter, Turner, XXYY syndrome. We have all these different categories, and so they would say, well, if sex is determined by chromosomes, then we have way more than two sexes here, because look at all these different compositions that we can have. So this is fundamentally based on this misinterpretation or this conflation of how sex is determined with how sex is defined, okay? So I'm gonna kind of go over what those mean. So broadly speaking, we have what are called sex determination systems, okay? These are the mechanisms that cause an individual to develop down a pathway that leads to the existence of a male or a female. In humans and birds, we have a chromosomal sex determination, but some other animals, like a lot of reptiles, they have temperature-dependent sex determination. So whether they develop into males or females depends on the temperature at which the eggs were incubated, okay? So completely different, it's an environmental factor. Other species do it with, social surroundings, how dense the population is, can determine whether they go down a certain pathway that leads to being a male or female. There's a lot of different sex determination systems, but ultimately they're creating just two sexes. So when we're talking about what sex an individual is, all we're talking about is whether this individual has the reproductive capacity to produce sperm or ova, okay? That's what sex is. That's all sex is. Sex is not sex determination systems. That's a whole different thing. And then there's some downstream consequences of sex. which are differences in morphology, physiology, and behavior. Heather did a great job going over a lot of these things. Antlers that are evolved in male deer, there are different behaviors when they go into the rut. Humans are sexually dimorphic. There's dimorphism in the types of hormonal milieux that we're producing. Those are all downstream consequences of sex. So it's important to bracket these three things. We have sex determination mechanisms. These are sort of the upstream causes of sex. Then we have sex itself, definitely binary. The upstream causes are not binary. And then we have the downstream consequences, which is all the morphology, physiology, behavior. And again, those things are not binary either. No one's ever claiming that they are. But it's just important to say that all those things are not sex per se, except for the middle thing. That's what it means to be male or female. So forward. Okay, so armed with that knowledge, we can reclassify what all these different, what they would posit as multiple sexes are. So we can see that they're actually just composed of two sexes, males and females. Yes, so just two sexes, because they're trying to conflate sex-determining systems or sex, chromosomes with outcomes, but really those are just different compositions, different chromosomal compositions within the male and female category. So we're going to go back and now talk about sex eliminationism, which again is this notion that sex exists on this spectrum of individuals where you can only statistically approximate sexes. Sexes aren't real. It's interesting to point out that these arguments are actually in conflict with the sex expansionist approach, because if you don't think sex is real, then you certainly don't think there's a finite number like 5 or 6 or whatever. But they never debate with one another. It's always them, those two groups, which are actually the same people, debating with people like me who say there's only 2 sexes. Because the goal isn't really to have, find out how many sexes there are or destroy sexes. It's really just there can't be 2 in their minds.
And there you go. This is the proof that it's a cult ideology, is they don't argue with each other. They only argue with the people who are spouting the truth.
That's the only thing. So you get the same people using arguments about, there's 5 sexes, and then they'll flip, once you destroy that argument, they'll say, oh, well, sex isn't even a thing at all. So it just depends on the context, however they can win an argument. So this is, you usually hear these types of arguments. The sex elimination one is encapsulated in the term sex is a spectrum. And this has 2 main sort of arguments to argue that sex is a spectrum. One is based on intersex conditions, and the other is based on secondary sex characteristics. So intersex conditions are basically these conditions that people can have that result in the appearance of ambiguous sex in terms of their genitalia, or sort of a mismatch between their chromosomes and their outward appearance of sex. And then secondary sex characteristics are basically the differences that arise during puberty. Males grow taller, we get more upper body strength, we have voices get lower, more facial hair. Women develop breasts, they have wider hips and certain fat distributions. So these are things that develop downstream. These are the downstream consequences of sex. And they're called secondary sex characteristics for reasons, because they're secondary to what it means to be male or female. Let's go forward. So we're going to talk about the intersex conditions first, the argument from intersex conditions. So this, I think, has been stated very clearly by Alice Drager. And she said in her book, I think it was Hermaphrodites and the Medical Invention of Sex, when she says hermaphrodites, she means intersex people, so just keep that in mind. So she said that hermaphroditism causes a great deal of confusion, more than one might first appreciate, because, as we will see again and again, the discovery of a hermaphroditic body raises doubts not just about the particular body in question, but about all bodies. The questioned body forces us to ask what exactly it is, if anything, that makes the rest of us unquestionable. So I think that's kind of the distillation of the argument from intersex conditions, saying that some people are intersex. What really is sex? We can't really say anything about anyone's sex if some people are, have these conditions that sort of blur this line. But this might sound like really profound if you don't know anything about what males and females are, but it's just sort of the pseudoscientific woo-woo. It's just completely not true that because some people might, who are at a glance difficult to place in a male or female box, based on their genitalia, that we're all somehow in this, cast into this realm of complete uncertainty. That's just not the case. Most people, like a coin flip, are either male or female. You don't get a coin flip that's 70% heads on a single flip. It's either going to be heads or tails. Maybe you'll get, with the nickel, I think 1 out of every 6,000 flips will land on its edge. That doesn't negate the existence of a heads or a tails. And the prevalence of intersex conditions is about the same prevalence likelihood of a nickel landing on its edge, from 1 in 5,500. So go forward here. So we also see graphs like this. This was in Scientific American, just trying to make sex seem so complex that we can't say anything. We seem to throw up our hands and let people self-identify any sex that they want to. So the idea here is that intersex conditions aren't evidence that there aren't more than 2 sexes or against the sex binary, because intersex conditions don't result in reproductive systems that can or would or did produce a 3rd or 4th type of gamete. So they would need to produce something like a spurg or a speg in order for this to be, in order for an intersex condition to truly be like a new sex, okay? Again, sex ambiguity is not a 3rd sex. Okay, intersex conditions, if maybe we're all exposed to radiation and future generations, have 50% prevalence of intersex conditions, that still wouldn't mean there's more than two sexes. It would just mean there's a lot of people who are difficult to place at a glance. They have intermediate appearing genitalia. There would still only be two sexes. So the prevalence of intersex conditions has no bearing whatsoever on how many sexes there are. Sex is still binary, no matter how many, the prevalence of intersex conditions. Okay, so we're going to move on to the arguments from secondary sex characteristics. And remember, these are the characteristics that sort of differentiate during puberty. We're talking like Adam's apples in men, facial hair, upper body strength, breasts in women, et cetera. This is in scientific papers, but it's also in your child's classroom. This is the gender-bred person. A lot of you have probably seen this before. And we're just going to zero in and see how they describe biological sex. So zooming in, one, they won't even say male or female. They just say maleness or femaleness, and they all start from 0 and go to wherever. And the description of biological sex here is the physical sex characteristics you're born with and develop, including genitalia, body shape, voice pitch, body hair, hormones, chromosomes, etc. They don't even mention gametes, which is the universal defining feature of males and females across the entirety of life. And they're using things like body shape and voice pitch. This determines your sex. Like a hairy girl is like more of a male. Yeah, go forward. So they even like have these sliding scales that are like examples. Here's a male, it's sort of intermediate on the male part. And it's completely, ridiculous. No, you can go for it. So if we take this idea seriously, dead seriously, and say like, okay, maybe secondary sex characteristics do define your sex, let's see where that leads us. So you might see figures like this. They'll say that, well, breasts, how tall individuals are, these are secondary characteristics. They exist on like this bimodal spectrum, and they would say either a combination of characteristics or characteristics by themselves, sort of cluster like this, and we have males are the ones that kind of cluster in the male hump over there, and females are we classify those as the individuals that approximate the features that are on the female hump. But if we want to take them seriously and start like asking what certain individuals along this graph actually represent, we can just start asking something like, is male A more male than male B? What is on the x-axis? Is this penis size? Is this voice pitch? Is this body hair? Like, again, this is completely ridiculous. Is female D, are they more female than female C? Again, what is on this, what is being measured here? And so there's a scenario I like to bring up here that really shows this isn't just scientifically flawed, but it's socially regressive and I think equally sexist to both males and females, both men and women. Thank you. So we can imagine a scenario where you have this boy. Maybe he just went through puberty. It wasn't, didn't produce typical masculine features. He's quite short. He doesn't have much facial hair to speak of. His voice didn't really drop very much. Very effeminate. Maybe he discovered he's now same-sex attracted. He's getting relentlessly bullied on the playground because, of all these effeminate characteristics, and all the other guys are playing football or whatever, doing, traditionally masculine stuff, and they're bullying him relentlessly, and, they're
So this pretty much describes me other than being gay. I'm short, I guess. I mean, what does he mean by effeminate features? I don't know. I mean, I'm not the most masculine looking man, I would say, but I think I look all right as a man.
Teasing him and saying, what are you, a girl? You look like a girl. You have all these, feminine features. And then Billy's very distraught, crying, goes to his teacher, to try to ask the teacher what's going on. Says, teacher, they're calling me a girl. Is this true? Like, what's going on here? And the teacher thinks long and hard, thinks about the sex spectrum, everything they've learned, thinks about the gender-bred person, what they've learned from the gender unicorn, what they've learned from the gender elephant. And he pauses long and hard, and he thinks to himself and then responds to Billy, maybe you are a girl. And this is really what...
So you can see that I'm thankful that I was well into adulthood before this time period that we're in right now.
Where it leads, we need to go down this pathway that we're defining what it means to be a boy or a girl, or a man or a woman, or male or female, by these secondary sex characteristics. Billy, under this, this idea, would be a girl. Like, that's just where it leads. It's very socially regressive. So forward. So what does a graph like this actually mean? So let's put a feature. Let's say this is height or something, a secondary trait that we have that makes us differentiate during puberty. Well, instead of becoming more or less male and female as you move right or left across this graph, what we have really is, well, there's two populations here. This is not just one population, there's two. And that population is comprised of two sexes, males and females. And so when you're moving left or right across this graph, you're not becoming more female and intersex and then male. What's happening is the proportion of individuals who are males and females rises and falls depending on where you are across as height increases or decreases. That's all that means. There's still two populations here. There's still just males or females. And this is really basic. This is stuff you guys obviously already know about. It's intuitive, again, sanity affirmation therapy. So these arguments aren't even, they're both wrong, but they're also self-refuting. This idea that sex is a spectrum or exists on multiple levels, and we can just talk about your chromosomal sex or your hormonal sex or your brain sex and all that stuff. They're self-refuting because they all fundamentally rely on the sex binary, the binary gametes, okay? Because how could we know that people who are XX tend to be females and those who are XY tend to be males unless we knew that males and females were something apart from their chromosomal makeup? How do we know that crocodiles are males and females based on the temperature that they're incubated at, if we didn't already know that sex was something apart from the temperature that they're incubated? How do we know that males tend to have penises and humans tend to have vaginas if we didn't know that sex was something apart from whether you have a penis or a vagina? How do we know that testosterone is associated with being male and estrogen is associated with being female if we didn't already know that sex is something apart from your hormonal makeup? Same with morphology. How do we know that human females tend to have breast developed, that males tend to grow beards, if we didn't know that their sex was something apart from their beards and their breasts? And also behavior. How do we know that males are more aggressive? How do we know it's the male deer that engage in this fierce combat in elephant seals if we didn't know that their sex was something apart from their behaviors? And what's the thing that is the reference point for all of these things? The gametes, whether or not the individual is producing sperm or ova. So what they're trying to spread out as these multiple levels of sex, it's really just all rooted in gametes. So their arguments don't even get off the ground before they start because they all presuppose that this is the true general understanding and meaning of what it means to be male and female. So I think I know what next slide is. Okay, yeah.
I do want to point out here that I did do a video about a chimeric woman, Emily Quinn. She's a man. Yet she, for all intents and purposes, is a woman. So this is probably where a lot of these people are getting tripped up, because she has internal reproductive organs, but then when it comes to her the parts of her body, the ovaries, those are actually testicles in her case. Now, we wouldn't know that 200 years ago. We didn't have the science to understand that, but we do now.
So what's going on here in the biology of sex? So you might have heard that we used to think back in the day that the Earth was the center of the solar system, okay? All our hubris, we thought, humans are so great, this must be the center of not just the solar system, but the universe itself. And so when we made these models of a solar system, naturally we put the Earth in the center. And then we make observations about the motions of all the other planets. And there's a lot of weird stuff going on out there if we assume that the Earth is the center. Okay, we see like Mars's motion, and it's doing these weird loop-de-loops, and so we have to make these loop-de-loops in our model of the solar system. They call these epicycles. They add them to them. Then all the other planets are doing this, and they'll find some other anomaly, and they got to add more of these loop-de-loops. So they're not just orbiting the Earth, but they're also sort of orbiting something else in the orbit. Of course, it's all crazy because there's no explanation for these epicycles. They were just needed because the observations were just out of whack. So they needed to construct these more and more complex models of the solar system to account for the fact that they were just wrong about where the center of gravity was. So when they finally came to their senses and said, just maybe the sun is the center of our solar system, then it changed this incredibly complex patchwork model, super complex thing, into this. This is very elegant, and it comports with the scientific principle of parsimony, which means you don't make a model more complex. All else being equal, the model that's the least complex tends to be or should be favored. Okay, and this is a perfect example. This is incredibly parsimonious. It explains like the Mars retrograde motion, and same with Mercury. And all you had to do is just move one little variable to the center. Okay. And so we improved. We went from a place of more complexity to a place of more elegance and simplicity and much more explanatory power. Okay, go forward. So here's what happens in biology right now. This is a new paper. It's called Multivariate Models of Animal Sex. They want to break the binaries. They want to dethrone gametes from being the center of gravity in sex biology. And here's what happens when you move gametes from the center of gravity in sex biology. This is a real figure from the paper. I didn't make this up. This is a real figure. They want to just say, oh, gamete size, that's just one aspect of sex. You have hormones, morphology, behavior. And then they say that this is a new model. This is a multivariate model of animal sex as a collection of traits representative as individual lines that contribute to the overall sex phenotype. Each trait has its own distribution, which may or may not be bimodal or coincide with other traits. It's just everything's thrown up in the air. We don't know. There's nothing that is inherently tying any of these together. I would argue that this is sort of the biological equivalent of an epicycle. But instead of going from a place of complexity and confusion to an area of simplicity, we're moving away from the complexity and explanatory power of gametes as the center of gravity in the sex solar system to this place of we don't know what's going on anymore. We're pretending like we don't understand what's going on. And this is, we're regressing. We're going away from parsimony. We're adding unneeded complexity. And we really need to, get things back on track because this is being used, again, I said, in court to justify trying to change kids' sex. So it really matters that whether or not you actually can change someone's sex and what sex is. We need to return to sort of natural biology, and that's why people like Heather are necessary to come up here and talk about that. And that's why it's important to understand the sex binary, and that's why it matters. So, thank you so much. So they said I can take a few questions. I'll just assume that when I hear a voice, I'll just look up.
Hi, Michael Reddy. I'm a family physician. I've dedicated headache practice for 15 years, and I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but something that you said just popped the light on, and I came to practice at around the time of the opiate crisis, and that was based a lot on self-identification, and I hear a lot of the echoes of that in this, and I became a follower of Dr. John Sarno, who was very big into mind-body evidence and mind-body syndrome, and he would always say, the only place the mind is separate from the body is in anatomy textbooks. And the thought that popped into my mind was, how is this not a different form of conversion therapy? And everyone is talking about, oh, conversion therapy is bad. But why is it not then bad to bring the body in line to the mind?
I think that's a point I've made before. Like this idea that conversion therapy is, we're trying to change the minds of gay people to match their body. Well, this is just achieving that through the opposite. We're changing their body to try to match their minds. And it's mainly happening with kids who are same-sex attracted because they tend to be the more gender non-conforming ones. And if you would normally naturally grow up to just be a gay adult who's happily gender non-conforming, or not, and then you're changing their body and now claiming that this person is now straight, I don't see how that isn't just conversion therapy by another name. It's I totally agree.
Colin, thanks so much for your talk. I've been bursting with this question since you were speaking. And what I want to try to understand, you may not know, but so we are living in a world where truth and reality are ceasing to exist. And as you showed, as you demonstrated, the genderbread person, the spectrum of maleness, femaleness, traits, characteristics, when this is going into scientific journals, where was the pushback from our colleagues in science and medicine? It's not, as you pointed out, it's not that complicated what defines a male or a female. And how did it get this far, and why has it been allowed? Because I cannot understand why there hasn't been more resistance to this message that has been allowed to really infect society. That's how I see it.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's completely insane, and I've been talking about this for 5 years, and I can still count the people who talk about this, the biologists who are speaking up. One of them's here, two of them, Carol as well, probably some others who are in the audience, but at least biologists with a platform of any significant degree. There's still so few of us talking about this. Some journals are starting to open up a little bit. I've been contacted by some editors who sort of want me to be publishing pieces here to push back against some of this, just to have some sort of counter argument in the scientific literature, because right now they're just running rampant through everything, and they see what happens when people like me or Carol speak up. I mean, they go after us super hard. I mean, I have to have a Substack that's keeping me so I can't be canceled anymore to talk about this stuff. That gives me the ability to come up here and talk about this stuff, because the biologists out there see what happened to people like me, like Carol, like Heather, and it sends a signal that if you talk about this, we're going to try to cancel you as well. This isn't comport with DEI. You're making students feel unsafe on campus by publishing these types of things. That's the message that's out there right now. So. Yeah, I think it's getting better. It is less controversial to talk about this. I mean, I could never have talked to a room like this about this. 5 years ago, it was unheard of. We weren't organized, but now we are, and I think we're moving in the right direction. More people are going to talk about it. I just had a paper, I had a book chapter with Emma Hilton in a peer-reviewed book, in a Routledge book about sex and gender. So now it can finally be cited, the sex binary. I joke that we're going to be given like the Nobel Prize for rediscovering the sex binary. So I'll happily accept. But yeah, we need more papers. We need things to cite. We can't just be citing Quillette articles on this stuff because it makes us look crazy. But yeah, the world is crazy. So. Okay,
Colin,
one last question.
Hi, one more. Particularly, how do we get this basic, intelligent information, particularly Heather's, into the K through 12 curriculum? How do we do that? That's what's needed.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it needs to start as local as possible. Try to get on the school boards as much as you can to try to take control of the mechanisms that will allow you to have some say over what's in your student's classroom. And I know that some states like California have passed these sort of legislation about gender affirming care that can be taught. So there might be difficulties there, but I really think it starts, close by as much as you can, getting on school boards, trying to overturn those, trying to bring things to a place of sanity. A lot of the gender affirming people, a lot of these are sort of childless activists, and they're just busybodies. They have a lot of free time because they don't have kids. And so there are the ones that are joining these boards and causing all this havoc on all the people who have kids and whose kids are affected by their policies. So we need to be as much as busybodies as they are, which will make us even more busy because we shouldn't have to do this, and it can't be a full-time job. So we just need to rally, I think, to say the least.
All right, so there's that. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.